In this presentation, I'd like to introduce some international experiences and models for climate financing and discuss some options for Senegal in developing its financing strategies for its sectoral adaptation plans. So I'd like to begin with a brief history of National Adaptation Plans, or NAPs, and global progress toward national adaptation planning. We'll briefly review the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC guidance for NAPs and its relevance to financing. And then finally, we'll talk about addressing financing in the national adaptation planning process and some specific international examples of how other countries have tried to address adaptation financing strategies. So just to provide a little bit of background on the national adaptation planning process, I'd like to review some history behind NAPs and their predecessors, the NAPAs. So in 2001, at the 7th UNFCCC Conference of Parties, or the COP7, the UN directed guidance and funding for preparing national adaptation programs of action, or NAPAs, which focus on project-level, urgent, and short-term priorities. Then in 2010, at the COP16, the UN established processes for countries to formulate and implement national adaptation plans, or NAPs. In 2015, at the COP21, the UN required countries to engage in this adaptation planning process and implementation of adaptation actions. So the result of that is that many more countries are undertaking efforts to develop national adaptation plans. And so, unlike NAPAs, the predecessor, NAPs focus on medium-term and longer-term climate risks and priority actions. They involve continuous stakeholder engagement and government ownership of the adaptation process, and they mainstream climate adaptation and link specifically to national development plans and sector strategies, to regional and local planning, and also to government policies and budgeting processes. And the point, of course, that we want to emphasize in this workshop is that NAP should include a strategic approach to climate adaptation financing and implementation. The UNFCCC guidelines for NAPs are not the central focus of our discussion about adaptation financing. However, it's important to review these briefly, I think, because there's an important point about strategic adaptation financing that we can take away from a review of the UNFCCC guidelines. In the UNFCCC guidance, there are 4 elements that describe a series of actions for preparing a NAP. Countries have flexibility to tailor the NAP processes to their specific laws, policies, and procedures. And each of these elements describes some potential activities that a country could undertake to advance the national adaptation planning process in their own country context. So the first element involves laying the groundwork for national adaptation planning. Then element B describes preparatory elements that a country could consider. Element C describes implementation strategies, and element D describes reporting, monitoring, and reviewing activities. So I'd just like to review each of these elements briefly, just to present an idea of what each element is accounted for in the guidelines. So element A, laying the groundwork, might involve taking stock of information on climate change impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation, addressing capacity strengths and weaknesses and undertaking in that process, iteratively assessing development needs and climate vulnerabilities. So these are examples of activities a country could take on under the element A activities. Element B describes some preparatory elements that could include assessing current climate and future climate change scenarios, assessing climate vulnerabilities and identifying and appraising adaptation options at multiple scales, or integrating adaptation into national and subnational development and sectoral planning. Element C describes implementation strategies, and these activities could include developing long-term national adaptation implementation strategies, enhancing capacity for adaptation planning and implementation within institutions, promoting coordination and synergy at regional level and with other multilateral agreements. And element D describes activities that countries could undertake to improve reporting, monitoring, and review of their adaptation processes. So this could include monitoring and reviewing the NAP process to assess progress, effectiveness, and gaps, iteratively updating their NAPs, and reporting on progress and effectiveness of NAP process. So again, I wanted to review these quickly because you'll notice that in none of the elements that we review here do you see a mention of strategic adaptation financing. And in approximately 140 pages of the UNFCCC guidelines, there are approximately 2 sentences about financing adaptation. The UNFCCC guidelines recommend that countries identify or assess possible sources of funding for other forms of support for adaptation implementation, and identify and assess options for mobilizing financial, technical, and capacity building support. But that's about all the guidance that the UNFCCC guidelines offer for countries to develop any kind of strategic financing plan for their adaptation activities. CEADIR likes to emphasize the importance of considering financing early in the context of NAP planning. So we think that financing considerations should come along with the very first NAP planning activities, whether you're following the UNFCCC guidelines and starting with element A, or if you're developing your own process for identifying strategic financing options. We think this should be an important consideration early on in the NAP process because it allows countries to prioritize actions. And this is an important consideration because countries can identify a suite of adaptation actions that could have be very effective, technically speaking. They could be quite feasible in other aspects of adaptation implementation, but if there are very few or none at all options for financing, it's very unlikely that those options will be successful. Considering financing early also helps countries build a diverse portfolio of adaptation actions. CEADIR recommends that countries think about diverse adaptation programs and projects that could appeal to a diversity of potential funders. So that might include large projects with multiple activities that could require a large investment and a long-term take on implementation and operations and maintenance, or it could include some smaller and less complex activities that could appeal to a very different type of potential funder. Addressing financing also helps explore a diverse set of financing options and sources, just as you want to diversify the types and the scopes of the different adaptation actions in your portfolio. You also want to diversify the types of financing mechanisms and instruments and sources and options that are available in the strategic financing approach. Considering financing early also helps allow countries to plan for changes to budgets and policies. Integrating adaptation financing and integrating adaptation programs and projects into existing domestic budgets is an important consideration for sustaining adaptation investments over time. But that can require some advanced planning to mainstream adaptation activities into existing budgets and to perhaps leverage existing budgets to direct more funds or maximize the outcomes of adaptation activities. Can take planning in advance of the national budget cycle and can require some assessment of the policies that either enable or can pose a challenge to mainstreaming adaptation into national budgets. So this is an important consideration as you're identifying specific adaptation actions and identifying financing strategies for each of those individual actions. And finally, planning for financing early in the NAP process can help build the administrative capacity of institutions to be able to secure financing for adaptation actions, and then, of course, to manage those investments and administer them over time as part of a longer-term sustainability plan for adaptation implementation. So now I'd like to present a few different models for addressing adaptation financing in the NAP process. And we'll first start with an example of how to integrate an integrate a financing strategy into an implementation strategy or an action plan. And we'll talk about an example from Rwanda. We'll also discuss an example of preparing a freestanding national adaptation financing strategy that's separate from an adaptation implementation or action plans. And we'll talk about an example from Albania there. And then we'll also show an approach that CEADIR has taken that involves financing building blocks analysis and action plan. And we'll talk about an example from CEADIR's work in Peru. So the first model from Rwanda demonstrates this financing strategy that directly links to and builds onto an implementation action plan. So in Rwanda's national strategy, they've identified a financing pillar, and some elements of this pillar involve identifying domestic financing priorities, which in Rwanda they've identified a priority of operationalizing the National Climate and Environmental Fund, securing grants from international funds, and supporting payments for environmental services approaches. They've also identified another strategy for using domestic sources from budgets and taxes on harmful activities to finance adaptation. And that involves creating tax exemptions and subsidies for environmentally friendly practices, and also providing exemptions from value-added tax and import duties for renewable energy investments. So Rwanda has directly linked its financing strategy into its national strategy for low carbon development, and has identified these specific actions based around this financing pillar. One activity that Rwanda began with in developing its financing pillar is to build this external financing map. So basically you can see that they have listed potential funding sources on the left side of this matrix, and then across the top they've listed some sectors that they're focusing on for adaptation implementation. And this is a relatively simple matching exercise to think about potential financing sources and how they might map to specific sectoral activities. So this is one example of an initial step that a country could take in developing its financing strategy by thinking systematically about which potential financing sources might be most appropriate and most feasible for addressing specific adaptation needs at the sectoral level. A second example of a financing strategy comes from Albania, and Albania has developed a freestanding financing strategy. In other words, it's not built directly into its implementation and action plan like Rwanda's. So in Albania, the financing strategy has identified potential financing options that include national government commitments and sustained financing from the domestic public sector, and also shifting multilateral and bilateral financing to priority adaptation actions. So that's an example of mainstreaming adaptation into existing development and sectoral activities by looking at ways to leverage existing financing sources and direct them to adaptation activities and to maximizing the outcomes of some of those other development and sectoral activities. Albania's financing strategy identifies and assesses domestic and international public and private sources of adaptation finance. So similarly to Rwanda's, it sort of takes a survey of potential financing options for adaptation. It also maps financing sources and instruments to the costs of adaptation priorities. And it breaks projects down into their individual phases. So investment, perhaps that might involve implementation or construction, the operations and maintenance phase, and the administrative phase, or the longer-term sustainability plan. It also explores opportunities to strategically leverage domestic budgets. So again, that's planning ahead of the national budget cycle to identify existing funding streams to leverage for maximizing the outcome of development activities and directing some of those funds toward specific adaptation activities. Finally, the third model that we'd like to discuss involves an assessment and analysis of the financing building blocks. And this is an example from Peru, where CEADIR is working to support the government in assessing its ability to access adaptation financing. And so we want to emphasize this as an important point. Even if a country can identify a diversity of potential financing sources and can map those sources to the most appropriate sectoral activities, it's important to consider the current capacity for accessing the adaptation financing sources that a country has identified. And so this activity to assess the financing building blocks can help prepare a country and to identify the current strengths and limitations in the institutional capacity to access adaptation financing. So in Peru, CEADIR is helping to match potential financing sources to priority sector-level adaptation actions. Similarly to Rwanda's approach, it's matching potential financing sources to the adaptation actions that stakeholders have identified at the sector level. And it also, similar to Albania's strategy, tries to map these activities at a little more in depth by breaking adaptation programs and projects out into their component activities and to match individual financing sources to even different phases or different tasks within an adaptation project or program. And this helps build a much more diverse and stronger adaptation portfolio by targeting very specific adaptation actions, even within one project, to multiple potential funders. And the financing strategy in Peru also included an analysis of the financing building blocks and recommendations for addressing gaps in the building blocks. So the 3 building blocks that CEADIR has worked with include the enabling environment around adaptation financing, the capacity and information that institutions have to identify potential financing sources and develop complex technical proposals for financing, and also the financing mechanisms and instruments that are available to any individual institution for implementing adaptation actions. So here we have just a simplified framework that shows these 3 building blocks: the enabling environment, which might involve creating an appropriate enabling environment to incentivize public and private investment in adaptation; the capacity and information building block, which describes institutions' ability to prepare projects for adaptation financing and to access information about financing options and the tools that would be needed to implement adaptation financing; and finally, the financing mechanisms and instruments building block, which involves creating or strengthening financing mechanisms for adaptation and facilitating private sector access to financial instruments. So in our next sets of presentations, we'll discuss these building blocks in more detail and discuss how we can assess each of these building blocks to identify the strengths and limitations of the current enabling environment, the current capacity information, and the current financing mechanisms and instruments that are available to your institutions right now for accessing adaptation financing. So just to summarize, the CEADIR team has reviewed national adaptation plans that other countries have submitted to the UNFCCC, and we've also reviewed some other adaptation planning documents that countries have produced through their adaptation planning processes. And some of our key findings include this finding that implementation plans are often not strategic. In other words, countries aren't thinking very early on in the adaptation planning process about potential financing sources, about how they can access these financing sources, and about how they can match individual adaptation actions and activities to the most appropriate financing source to build a diverse portfolio. National adaptation plans often lack analysis of the current ability to finance adaptation actions. And this is important because even if there are plenty of financing options available and appropriate for a specific adaptation action, if a country doesn't have the capacity to access specific streams of financing, it's very unlikely that they'll be able to secure that financing to support priority actions. And finally, the financing analysis is often limited to just an inventory of domestic and international sources. So we think this is an important place to start, just as Rwanda, just as Albania and Peru have begun to take a survey of potential financing sources and begin to map those sources to individual adaptation activities. This is a very useful place to start, but we encourage countries to go even further and to map those financing sources against individual project components, and also to assess the building blocks to be able to understand a country's readiness to access financing for any individual action component. So we'll, in the following presentations, we'll discuss a strategic financing approach that will involve an assessment of the building blocks and can help us move beyond just taking a survey of potential financing sources and actually developing a strategic action plan for securing financing for priority adaptation actions. And on this slide, we have just a couple references from the NAP Global Network. And these are very useful references that the CEADIR team has found to support financing planning for supporting national adaptation plans.